Hey everyone, welcome to update 3 for Crescent Revamped. This week we didn't exactly get to implement everything we wanted to. We didn't get to the user interface yet. We did, however, implement a tutorial level. Uh, we brought in some old mechanics from the previous game, some new ones as well. And then I guess we also added audio. Alex added a few soundtracks here. I believe we have a couple. We got some sound effects, some songs, uh, yeah, enemy sounds, just the basic stuff, I guess. So yeah, let's get started. So as you see here, we uh, there's a background music playing for the level selector. We didn't know exactly where to put the tutorial level as of now, so as of now we just kind of put it near like the door here where the house is stationary. So you kind of just press the X button on your controller. We're going by PlayStation controller here because we thought it would make it a lot easier just kind of picking out one controller and supporting it, because with Unity they have all these types of input controls that are different depending on the depending on the generation. So Xbox 360, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, PS3, all different controls. So yeah, there's that, and then there's also trying to figure out a controller that we both have between me and Alex that would make it a lot more easier, because he was using an Xbox One controller and I was using the PS4. But I digress. Let's start on with the tutorial level here. Got the music. We kind of want to keep it simple with how the controls are being shown. So as you scroll by, you kind of get shown the controls and kind of get to test them out for yourself. So for camera zoom, it would be like L1 to zoom in, R1 to zoom out, and then if you're using keyboard, it would be Q to zoom in or E to zoom out. There's the camera functionality. So here's a new, kind of old, kind of new mechanic. It's so the jump dash was in the previous version of Crescent, but I decided it would be great to re-implement it into this one as well. So to do the jump dash, you either do a combination of X and O, or X and the circle on your PlayStation controller, or you can do space and F, space bar and F, which is essentially just jumping and then hitting another button after that. So since I'm using controller, I can demonstrate this real quick. Jump dash, jump dash. We got a cool little effect going for it as well, and some oh yeah, you guys, I don't know if you guys noticed, there's also some camera shake going on. That's another thing we worked on, is camera shaking. So yeah, let's move on. We got the attacking, which is pretty basic. R2 on the controller, right trigger, or left click with the mouse. And we keep going here. Oh, don't mind that. Low on storage, desktop storage. Okay, so oh yeah, this is another new mechanic that we're working on called Crescent Light. So for those that didn't know, Crescent is actually this little moon character right here, and he kind of plays a role in the game as well when it comes to the puzzle mechanics. So let's press square. It's a cool little power-up effect right there. So what this allows us to do is it actually allows us to control Crescent like it was like our ordinary player. and then to go back, we just press square or V again, and then we're back. That will play a role in level 2, where it's more lighting based. You guys will be able to see where Crescent would become a little bit more useful in that type of scenario. Oh yeah, so this is another mechanic we added, which is parrying with projectiles. Obviously these are not projectiles right now, but they eventually will be when it comes to enemies or mobs. So how you parry these objects is you essentially just get close to them with your sword, I guess, in this case, and then just use your attack button. So in this case it's R2 or left click, and then you'll be able to parry any projectiles of this color, as you see labeled here. So let's try that out. So get close, parried, parried, and parried. So that's how you parry objects. And then let's continue down with the tutorial. Dash there. So then you see here, which is essentially the parry power-up. So once you actually parry 3 projectiles, you unlock a power-up, which has somewhat been implemented. Like the idea is there, but the actual functionality is not quite there yet. So let's press triangle. As you see here, my character now has a gun. So once you actually parry 3 projectiles, you get a 30-second power-up once you press triangle, and it'll allow you to shoot a gun. So you get to fight back with your own projectiles in a way, which is kind of cool. So after 30 seconds, this is eventually going to go away. Why I said this wasn't really completed yet is because you can't actually shoot anything. As you see here, it's playing like a slash sound effect while I'm holding a gun. So yeah, it isn't fully there yet, but the idea was at least started, I guess. It was at least, it's at least there. There's like a foundation. So as you see here, 30 seconds pass, I'm back to my sword stance. And those are all the controls. And then you just exit, press X. Oh, there you go. We already went through level 1, I believe, last update. I guess we can show the level 2. There you go. So as you see here, level 2 is actually has some lighting effects here, and you see Crescent's actually lighting up himself. So let's take a stroll through. Level 2 is not fully complete yet, but it was started a bit. We did start a little bit of it. So as you see here, there's mobs right here. There's a spider. That's another thing we added. There's I think 2 new mobs we added to level 2. A spider and I believe like a black panther or something like that. Oh. Oh. These spiders have a little bit more health. It's gonna take oh. Wow, it's persistent. Oh. Okay, there you go. Oh, there you go. So do the Crescent power up, and then I'll be able to show you guys where Crescent comes into play. So his little light source that's attached to him, you could actually use for puzzles. So we were thinking with Crescent, we would probably use him in like a really dark room scenario to kind of like unveil some sort of puzzle to the player. So let's say we had like a number sequence written on the wall, and it was really dark, so then you'd be able to use Crescent to kind of see what those numbers were to unlock a door or something like that in that regards. So there's the Black Panther here, I guess. I don't really know what to call this. It's like kind of like a black cat, some type of cat, I'm not sure. Just call it Black Panther for now. But yeah, there's not much to level 2. We kind of have like the basics going on. What we wanted to implement was also a user interface. We didn't quite get to that, which is kind of unfortunate, but hopefully we could get to that in the next update and finish off level 2 while we still can. But yeah, there's just kind of stairs that go up. Level 2 kind of continues like that. But yeah, with level 2 we kind of want to implement kind of like a usefulness for Crescent himself, because he's kind of just been bobbing and weaving behind our main protagonist here. So we're trying to give him a sense of significance, I guess. Jesus, I can't really talk right now. But yeah, so that's kind of where we're at with this, with the update 3. So we got the dash, we got the Crescent power up, parry power up, tutorial level, quite a few things actually. But again, we couldn't get to the user interface. Hopefully that's a next week update, and hopefully we could complete level 2 by then and get all the mechanics implemented into a level. But yeah, so that should be it for gameplay wise. I could talk a little bit about the code itself. So let's start off with the dash. I guess the dash is probably a good starting point. So for the dash, let's see if I could even find it here. Control F will be my savior, hopefully. There you go. Oh, I think it's this one. Yeah. So starts off pretty simple. We take the input from the player himself. We take the input, whether it's F on the keyboard or dash. In this case, this was actually set up in our project settings here. We have something labeled dash here in our input project settings. So whenever we use terminology such as input get button dash, it's actually referring to this, which is essentially joystick button 2. This is Unity's way of setting up the controller input. So joystick button 2 is essentially the circle button on a PlayStation controller. So once the script detects the input, and it also determines whether or not the player is facing left or right, it dashes, I guess. So the actual dash, we're just applying a constant velocity to the rigid body. So we're applying a constant force of 10.5. The reason why we didn't use add force was because we noticed something with add force, which was like, once you add let's say with add force I added 10 intervals of 10 to the x-axis, it would never truly be consistent. Like if I were to dash, it would be fast in one try, and then the second go, like the second time I would dash, it would be slower. So it was never really consistent, so we decided to use velocity instead. But yeah, so it just, dash is pretty simple. We just add a velocity of 10 to the x-axis, and then we camera shake. So to speak a little bit about the camera shake, I believe that's under its own function here. So with the camera shake, Um, we're actually starting a coroutine, uh, which doesn't really, which in a way, we could kind of just call from the coroutine, but it kind of makes it a little bit more simple because let's say you wanted to camera shake, like let's say I was, for example, under the dash, I'm camera shaking. So whenever I would want to camera shake, I would have to uh, do this start coroutine and then camera shaking, which is what we called it. Not the best of variable names, but I guess that'll do the job. But yeah, so whenever we would want to do the camera shake, even if it was under, like whenever we would want to call a camera shake, without this function we have here, we would have to constantly do this. So start coroutine camera shaking. So in a way, we kind of avoided that and just made a function and then called the coroutine from that, just to make things a lot more cleaner. So that way we could just do camera shake, something like that. And, and then that would call this function right here, which would start this coroutine. So camera shaking, so once you actually camera shake, once you call the function camera shake, it starts another coroutine called camera shaking. And in this coroutine, we it's kind of like the functionality of the shaking itself. We have the initial position of the we take the initial position of the camera, we put it inside of a vector 3. We create a vector 2 for the new position. And then for elapsed time, we set that to 0. And then we make a while loop. So while the elapsed time is less than the shake duration, which is essentially, the shake duration is how long you want the camera to shake. So while that while loop is going, we set the new position up here, the x, to a random range, so a random number between -1 to 1, and then times it by the magnitude, the camera I call it, in this case we call it the shake magnitude. And this is a predetermined number on the top of the character script. I believe it's right here. We define the variable shake magnitude, and then we set a default variable, which was 0.6. So once we set the actual positions, the new positions, we set the camera's position to a vector 3, and then we send it then the vector 2, so new position dot x and new position dot y, and then we send it its initial position on the z-axis. Since in a way you might be wondering, since this is a 2D game, why does the z-axis even matter in this case? So why the z-axis actually matters is because if you change the z-axis on the camera, it actually changes how far or how close the camera is actually looking. So if you see here, the position currently at -10, if I were to change this to, like, let's say 20, or like let's say 1, this camera would be let's change to 3D mode so you can actually get a visual representation of this. Believe if I control F, oh, there you go. So since the camera's on the z-axis, it's taking a bit to actually show. Okay, so it's now at 1. So when it's at 1, it's actually not even showing what's on this, like what we want the camera to actually show. So when it was at -10, it was in the range of the art itself. So this is essentially where the camera starts to look, or where the camera initially uh, can view the objects. So when it's at -10, it's within that range. When it's at, let's say, 5, it's not even in that range. As you can see in the camera preview, all it's showing is red. So that's why the z-axis is quite significant, and why we set it to its initial position, because we don't really want to mess with that value. So then we add elapsed time as well to so we can actually, you know, so we add elapsed time with time.delta time to ensure that this loop actually ends, because if this wasn't, if this was commented out, this loop, the camera would be shaking forever, because in a sense, since elapsed time is set to 0 and shake duration is initially set to 0.6, this loop will never end, because elapsed time will constantly be at 0. So this is why we added elapsed time and then added it to time.delta time, because in a way the value's changing, allowing the loop to eventually end. So once the loop actually ends, we have the shake duration and then the shake magnitude. So once the loop ends, we just set the default just in case, because there's some scenarios where we might want to change these values, so the shake duration. So for something like the Crescent light, or like the Crescent power up, we changed the shake duration to, like, I think around like 3 or 4, so it shakes for around 3 or 4 seconds, and then once that initial shake is done, it's set back to its initial values. So to talk about, what else is there to talk about? There's the Crescent power up. I guess that could be the next thing we talk about. So once the player hits, I believe it's V on the keyboard. Yeah. So once the player hits V on the keyboard, and we have a boolean here to see if the player can actually use the power up or not. I call these debounces to ensure that if we were to use an if statement, and then trying to find a way to explain this. So let's say you were to enable the power up, the Crescent power up, but then you immediately turned it off, even when there's statements such as camera shaking. It would break the game, I guess, to explain it in simpler terms. If this wasn't here, it would essentially be broken, because you would power up, and then let's say the player would immediately turn off the power up effect. The camera would still be shaking, since the shake duration is still at 5.5. So that's one of the main reasons we added this debounce, to ensure that the player couldn't just spam the power up, to kind of get like to kind of avoid the glitch, I guess. It would be glitchy. It would be glitching if it was if this debounce wasn't included. And then so it's we either take input on the keyboard, which is in this case V, or the controller, which is called Crescent transform. I believe that's also in here. Yeah, Crescent transform. So this checks for the joystick button 0, which is, I believe, the square button on a PlayStation controller. So it takes in that input, it ensures all these Boolean checks, or all these Boolean values are correct or set. So it sets the crescent can light to false. So this is where the debounce comes in. So since it's checking if it's true, we immediately set it to false. So in this way, the player can't just keep spamming the power up. So if crescent can light equals true, immediately set it to false. That way the player can't spam the move anymore. Set crescent can follow to false. So previously, crescent was following the player, and now was kind of in a loop. So to avoid problems, we made a Boolean value to check whether or not the crescent can either follow the player or it can't. So when crescent is following the player, this bool value is set to true. But in this scenario, since crescent will be the one in control through the power up, we set that to false to avoid issues. And then we set the camera. So we have two Boolean values when it comes to following the camera following. We have one for the player, and then one for crescent. So in a way, crescent is its own entity as well. So once you actually enable the power up, we set the Boolean value to camera for the camera follow player. So when this is set to true, the camera follows the player. So we immediately set it to false when the player enables his power up, and then we set the one for crescent to true. That way, it actually allows us to follow crescent rather than the player. We set the player movement to false, so this disables the player's movement. And then we add a light source. Yeah. Oh, this is the power up effect actually. We called it light source. It's not really a light source. Might have to rename that. This is more of a light effect, I guess. Power up effect. And then we set the camera shake duration to 5.5, and then we start the coroutine for the crescent light move, which we called it. And then we begin to shake the camera afterwards. So with the camera light move, I believe it's down here. We just set the crescent can move boolean to true, so this will allow the crescent to move around the map rather than the player. So yeah, that should be. So that we went over the dash, we went over dash, camera shaking, crescent power up. I believe we could talk about projectiles. So for the projectiles, we actually have a. Let me see here. Let me go in the tutorial level. So this is a lot more easier to explain. So with the parrying, we actually have a game object inside of our player, which we called sword, that has a box collider trigger. Let me see if I could visually show that. So as you see here, this is technically what the hitbox looks like for the sword. We made it bigger than it usually is because than it visually looks, because if we made the hitbox like this, it would be really hard to hit fast enemies going at a speed of like 9 or 10. So we made it a little bigger than usual, maybe like half its size. And then so we have it set to a trigger, So whenever that trigger collides with another trigger, such as these projectiles, it we have a check for that. We have an if statement. So in this scenario, when the two uh, colliders collide with each other and they're both triggers, we first check if it's an object that we can parry. So for these specific projectiles, we made a tag called parry, and if the tag is a parry object, then destroy the object, and then add to a variable called power up count, which is located inside of the character script, which is just a interval here. Oh, integer, my bad, sorry. So yeah, so public power up count is just a integer, and then in our sword script here, which is located in our sword itself, we called it sword collision. So we first destroy the projectile, and then we check if the power up count is less than 4, because you only need 3 to actually do the power up itself. And then once you have if you have less than 3, then add to that integer. So if power up count was equal to, let's say, 1, then add another one, add 1 to that value, and it'll become 2. So let's say power up count was initially 0, and this line of code took place, then power up count would be equal to 1. If power up count was equal to 1 and it was still less than 4, then power up count would be equal to 2, 3, and there you go. And then you'd be able to use the power up itself. Now with the power up itself, once you actually have 3, then once you actually parry 3 objects, we have a check. We check for the input as well, I believe, which is R on the keyboard. Yep, there you go. So it checks if the player hits R on their keyboard, or triggers the power up button, which in this case, again, project settings, input, power up, takes in joystick button 3. In this case, this would be the triangle button on the PlayStation controller. If you're wondering how we got these input controls, you can either test them in Unity just by going through, I believe it's 0 to 10 with these numbers. As you can see, joystick button 3, I believe it goes to 10. So you can manually test them, or you could just use Google and kind of get like a diagram of what button is what. So that kind of makes your life easier. Would recommend using Google. Definitely saves you a lot of time in that regard. So once you actually trigger that input, and power up count is either greater than or equal to 3, then trigger that power up where you're now able to use a gun, which adds in a cool little effect, as you saw probably maybe 20 minutes ago now. I'm not sure how long the video's been going for. So these 2 lines of code, they create a object of a already created prefab that we made, which is called power up effect, and it sort of spawns it into the game. In Unity we call it a I believe and
Instantiate.
I'm not really sure. I might butcher this pronunciation, but this is what we call it in Unity. Uh, Instantiate. I'm not sure. I'm gonna butcher that. But yeah, this is so to actually spawn stuff in, this is the method we call, I guess, to actually spawn in these effects. So it takes in three parameters. So first, it's actually the prefab itself, the power-up effect. Second, it's the position, and then third, the position that you want. So in this case, we just set it to the player's position since it's a power-up that revolves around the player, and then we just set it to the player's rotation. We parent that to the player itself to make it look a little bit cleaner, and then so this is where the actual gun is where the actual gun comes from. So we actually change animation controllers. So on default, this player is running off the player controller. I believe we have it under resources. So by default, the player is running on this default player controller here. And then once the power up is activated, we set the new animation controller to this gun animation controller, which allows the player to, which makes it visually look like the player is now holding a gun. I'm sorry if I've confused anyone through this video thus far. It's kind of hard explaining everything, all this code within like 20 minutes of a YouTube video. So once we actually change the animation controller, we begin to shake the camera. But before we do that, we set a shake duration of 1.5. So this will shake for around a second, quarter, I guess a second and a half. And then it starts a coroutine called stop gun power up. So what this does is it waits for 30 seconds and then it essentially disables the power up and you go back to your basic sword stance here again. Whew. So that should be everything, or at least a majority of the things we included in update 3. Again, I'm sorry if I confused anyone, or I'm sorry if I couldn't really explain things well. It's kind of hard to explain all this code within like a 20-minute video. We'll probably see sorry, we'll probably get to work with the user interface in the next update, and possibly finish off level 2. We didn't really get to finish level 2, as you see here. If I zoom out, it goes quite far, but it actually cuts off right here. So maybe we'll get to finish level 2, get to implement the enemies as well, because so far there's only really the spider and the cat, the Black Panther. So yeah. So hopefully my next update will have user interface finished level 2, and hopefully get some other stuff done while we're at it. Yeah, so far there's only really 2 enemies. We'll probably have to kind of copy and paste those enemies throughout the level. Finish off the level, implement user interface, especially when it comes to like the level selector. because you truly don't know if you're even triggering uh, a level change or any of that, uh, or any sort of level change, I guess. Because like if you hover over this, you don't really know if you're about to enter or triggering a level select here, kind of just hovering over and hoping for the best. So hopefully we can implement some sort of user interface to kind of give feedback whether or not a player is actually doing something. So yeah, that would be great. Maybe some settings to actually change the volume, stuff like volume, just sort of the basics, I guess. But yeah, I don't want to keep rambling on here. Thank you guys. If you stuck through the end, thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for listening. And hopefully we can catch you guys for update 4. Again, user interface level 2 completion. Maybe level 3. Hopefully we can start up a level 3. We're hoping by the end of this to at least get like 5 levels before think it's around like 5 updates, because we eventually have to present these this kind of prototype, I believe, on the 15th of November. So we still got a couple of weeks left. So hopefully we can at least get around 5 levels before the 15th of November, where we actually have to present this. But yeah, that should be it. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next update.